Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
The Southern Baptist Convention is descending on Dallas this week. It's a fitting location, given how many Dallas megachurch pastors have graced the headlines of BNG over the past year for not-so-good reasons. BNG has been previewing the annual meeting in the Stuck in the Middle with You podcast with BNG Executive Director Mark Wingfield and the Baptist blogger Benjamin Cole. Wingfield wrote an analysis piece last week titled Proposed SBC Resolutions Throw Red Meat to the Base, Avoid Key Issues. The convention plans not only to address traditionally popular topics such as gender and sexuality, but also in vitro fertilization. If you're interested in more detail about the resolutions, check out Mark Wingfield's piece as well as additional articles that are coming out. But amidst it all, one wonders what role institutions like churches, denominations, or conventions should even play in our lives. Do we give too much power and authority to pastors or denominational leaders? Given the amount of abuse that these organizations are so often caught up in, why are we so beholden to them? And is there any hope for any institution to have a more healing, liberating presence in the world? Or are they all going to end up getting caught up in abuse scandals at some point? While the SBC bloviates about how the entire nation is supposed to live according to their standards, I decided to go outside of the Baptist world this week to talk with Matt Tebbe. He is a co-founder of Gravity Commons, the co-author of the book Having the Mind of Christ, and he's an Episcopal priest at the Table Indy. I wanted to speak with him because his church was once part of another denomination, but he recognized issues related to abuse there and then left for another denomination. So he's had a lot of experience processing when institutions have too much power in our lives, when they're abusing their power, and when they're attempting to offer an alternative vision for liberation and wholeness and healing. So here is my conversation with Matt Tebbe. With the Southern Baptist Convention meeting in Dallas this week, we're focusing on the role denominations and institutions can play, both in harming us and healing us. And I know you've taken your church on a bit of a journey in and out of denominations, so I'm curious if maybe you could share some of that story with us.
Yeah, first of all, Rick, thanks for having me. And secondly, that's a really long story. But we left a fairly conservative Anglican denomination about almost 3 years ago now. And part of that was sort of what was emerging from, the 2016 MAGA phenomenon, and many of the voices within our denomination were getting much more strident and hardline in some positions that before 2016, just there was a little more permission and freedom to disagree about them. Things like racial justice um, and honestly, what precipitated our move was there was a number of church abuse scandals that were sort of mishandled by denominational leaders, and survivors were pulling together sort of an advocacy group to sort of, band together and call attention to things. And I decided to spend some of my capital in that denomination to amplify their voices and stand in solidarity with them, and that was not received well. And so part of our leaving was me being able to learn to name some of the hallmarks of what I'm coming to call like supremacy systems. Systems that don't have transparency or accountability, systems where power flows one way, right? There's pretty strict hierarchies, and
Mm-hmm.
the leadership tends to rally around and protect when any wrongdoing is done by those with power, because any failure by one leader is seen as an embarrassment to the entire institution, right? And so there's a reflexive need to protect the institution sort of at all costs, and I just couldn't abide that. So we ended up leaving and going to a more progressive denomination that has a lot. There's So I'll be clear, like abuse happens in all kinds of human organizations and institutions because we're sinful, cotton-headed ninny-muggins, and we do things that are jacked up. But you can create organizational protocols, accountability, transparency, etc. And I could talk more in detail about that, but I've just been impressed by the way that our new denomination has policies in place, not to protect the institution, but to protect the most vulnerable within the institution. And I think that's been a big difference that I've seen.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know for me personally, like I have a very hard time trusting any kind of institutions anymore.
Yeah.
And in fact, like when I went to seminary, I had a really great experience, and then I graduated and discovered there were abuse scandals there too. So it's
Yeah.
like you almost feel like you can never get away from this stuff. And like, I'm curious why you think so many institutions are prone to territorialism. And like, are there common
Mm.
theologies that you're finding, or cultural lenses, or just values that you're noticing?
Ah, yeah. I do think that human organizations, system theory, I think supremacist systems are anxious systems. And so one of the hallmarks of an anxious system is that the most unhealthy person is the one with the most power. And I think that that tends to happen in a lot of institutions. But I do think that systems that or organizations or institutions that have strict hierarchies where power is defined as control, and these are often buffeted and supported by theologies that tend to be more violent and controlling. I think I've experienced more harm and more abuse in those systems than ones that maybe do have a flow chart, right? They have an org chart, but there is an emphasis on empowerment, inclusion, um, solidarity with the vulnerable or marginalized. Like those things are not just maybe given tacit lip service, but there's actual embodied or concrete practices that do that. They tend to feel and be safer, in my opinion, because they actually take protocols for, abuse seriously. Like, for instance, I'm an Episcopalian, I'm in the Episcopal Church, and I don't know if you followed this, but Justin Welby just stepped down as the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he stepped down um, or he announced he was going to step down because it came out that about 20 years ago he had mishandled a reported abuse case under his jurisdiction. And I think 20 years ago I thought about abuse much differently than I do now. So I'm not excusing what Justin Welby did, but I'm saying I think we are living in a different time now than we were then. We have maybe different awareness, different convictions about how to handle things. But Justin Welby is like he's a big deal,
Hmm.
and he's a household name even for people who aren't connected to the Church of England. And he did something wrong 20 years ago. He owned that he did it wrong, but he stepped down. And I think about even today a very famous worship leader has six credible charges from ex-leaders who are saying that he's abused power over the last several years. And already he's doubling down and defending himself and scapegoating the accusers. And so I think there's a difference. Like what happens when allegations or accusations of abuse happen? Are they investigated? Do the people in charge step aside or get placed on leave? Or do they step down? Or do they scapegoat the allegers, And I think I don't know, I don't think there's any system immune to abuse, Rick, but I do think what are the protocols in place and how is there accountability and transparency in leadership, I think goes a long way to creating safer spaces.
Yeah. Like when I look at the Bible, and like the world that the Bible was written in, it was so marked by empire. And so a lot of the
Yeah.
theology that the biblical writers were processing and working through and writing about were how to live in a world of empires. And I feel like a lot of the abuse that I've experienced has been people trying to protect their empires.
Oh,
And I feel like a lot of the theology that I've come to deconstruct are theologies that look like empire to me. And and it seems like there are some conservatives that I get along with that they they recognize some of the power dynamics that cause harm, but maybe they're not as willing to question some of the theologies that look like empire as much as I
Yeah,
am.
yeah.
And like, so I guess that's kind of where I'm kind of struggling with is finding some of those relationships where you're starting to recognize these empire power dynamics, and then you're also in these awkward positions of wanting to get rid of the theological root, along with some people
Mm,
that may not be willing to quite go there.
yeah. Yeah, that's a keen point, Rick. I think I can't think of any scriptures that we have in the Bible that weren't written by people under the rule of another government. So the scriptures are written by colonized people or captured people. And that voice or that perspective, I think, actually is so important. And those are the voices that are typically not listened to or marginalized in churches that run on the logic of empire, you know? And so I think domination and control, um, extracting and capturing power and resources, like all of these instincts, we can't just like verbally denounce them. We have to actively decolonize, actively do work. Because I think you're right. I do think a lot of white Protestant Reformation Christianity was born in and around and out of a colonial ethos, and so much of the imperial colonial instinct is baked in. It's part of the architecture, you know. I mean, I'm a part of the State Church of England, and so part of me deciding to be in that is like my bishop is keenly interested in decolonizing our tradition and doing that not just in lip service, but in tangible, active um, engagements of solidarity and reparation. And so that's what interested me and drew me to this particular diocese that I'm in. And and so I guess what I'm saying is I don't know where there is a an institution that's decolonized, like a pure, pristine, decolonized space,
Hmm.
you know? Um, there are great organizations and communities doing that work, but they aren't typically for me, and my presence there would change the work they're doing. And
Hmm.
so I'm trying to find spaces that where I can learn, where I can do this hard work, because I think there is good work to be done inside these institutions to undo some of these imperial instincts that you're talking about and the theology that supports and gives rise to it.
Yeah. It's like I had an episode earlier this year with Chrissy Stroop, who is an atheist, and we were talking about how these impulses to dominate and to liberate are really present at the same time in all of us.
Mm,
And
mm.
even like in the Bible, you see Israel, on one hand, their story is in under the bondage of Egypt, and then at the same time, they end up having slaves themselves. And
Yes.
it's like, so we were talking, like, even though she's an atheist, like, she could see these, this wrestling with these impulses that are in all of us. And I wonder, like, maybe how have you experienced this transition from being shaped a lot by hierarchy and domination toward being shaped by liberation? How is that, and also like how has that affected your thoughts about institutions?
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. You know who gave me great language for this is a social worker from Canada named Sarah Schulman, who wrote a book called Conflict is Not Abuse. And then a black abolitionist activist named Adrienne Marie Brown. Sarah Schulman wrote a book called Conflict is Not Abuse. Marie Brown wrote a book called We Will Not Cancel Us. And Sarah's writing as a gay woman, a lesbian. Adrienne Marie Brown is a queer black woman, and they're writing about being a part of communities, Rick, that have been traumatized by supremacy cultures. And both of them are naming that supremacy culture is essentially, it's more than this, but it's not less than trauma with power, right? The slaves who've been traumatized get power and they enslave people.
Hmm.
right? Um, and both of them have given me language to understand like the work that needs to be done so that those of us who've experienced, named, and begun working through and metabolizing our trauma don't just end up replicating it,
Hmm.
right? And blowing it and passing it on through others. So I actually think that becoming trauma sensitive, trauma informed, trauma responsive, and then reckoning with how trauma mirrors supremacy is one vital piece of work that we're doing in our community. Um, the other thing is that I think the question that I'm most interested in when it comes to inhabiting institutions and having some kind of influence there is what's the operative power at work? And I as a Christian, I want to put my stake in the ground of love and figure out how love works differently than supremacy power,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
And I think that love has a logic, a shape, an architecture, a folkway, a common sense that is embodied in Christ and is in an antithesis to the logic and modalities of empire. And so for me, we have to build out some kind of relational commitment with each other in whatever organization we're in, where we have agency, right? But what's the operative power in that agency? So what's the telos towards where we're headed? What are people for? What are possessions for? All these questions are answered, I think, with how we define power. What are bodies for?
Hmm.
So for me, it's becoming more clear and more committed to love and how it works, and then empowering as many people as we can to foment and curate that ethos.
Yeah. Something I like, I've never heard of the somebody explore the idea of the Trinity as institution before. It just kind of popped into my head here.
Mm,
But like when I think about the trauma that a lot of us experience, like, and I look at the theology of the empire version of Christianity, so much of it is like this God as top-down power on the cross. God is basically the Roman Empire, is most clearly seen in the emperor and most clearly seen in the person holding the spear. And one thing that I've always struggled with is this idea of the father turning his face away. Like, you're so despicable that God just can't even look. The father had to turn his face away. And like, I think that as I'm getting to know some of these communities of Christians on the underside of power, the gospel I hear them talking about is more of like the revelation of God in and among the oppressed,
yes,
where the throne is a cross. It's like God telling us what God really thinks of our empires.
I agree with everything you said. There's no question in that, but I agree with you. Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think
But you think about like so you think like the Trinity as a three person in one. I was thinking like kind of like as an institution, it's not necessarily like as a top-down institution, it can cause a lot of trauma in the way we relate to it. But as like an institution that values the presence of God in and among the oppressed, it could have more of a healing, liberative feel to it. And if we reflected that kind of God in our institutions, in our togetherness, maybe that could
yes.
provide more healing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's the modality of love then. One expression of it is that the Trinity is committed to the relationality of the Trinity, right? And so I know there's some theologies, and the people who believe them say that this is a caricature or misrepresentation, you know, that there is no division in the Trinity, that the Father isn't doing divine child abuse to the Son, that it's willed within the Trinity that Jesus will die for humans. But there is a logic at work in that articulation of the cross that you were naming, that God uses violence to solve problems.
Hmm.
And I see on the cross the opposite. I see God revealing the problem of humanity by taking our violence. And not just revealing the problem of humanity, but also uh, subsuming and enfolding and embracing that problem, place sharing in that problem, dying in solidarity as the problem, and then defeating the problem. And so, to me, then thinking about the Trinity as an institution of love means that the Trinity fundamentally doesn't use human evil, violent means to solve problems. So God's not inflicting the cross on anybody
Yeah.
to solve a problem. You know, that's how we solve problems. And I think that God does a marvelous act in Jesus where God's able to take the most egregious evil and turn it into the most victorious good for those doing the evil. And I think that's how love works.
Yeah.
Mm.
I took my son to a play uh, a couple weeks ago, and it was at a church, and the outside of the building was a painting of Golgotha,
Mm.
and they had like all the characters there, the centurions, the people watching. They had Jesus on the cross, and I remember looking at it, and I was just thinking like, okay, where is God in this picture? And if God is this person who solves injustice through violence against human bodies, then God in this painting is the Roman centurion.
Yes.
But if God is the person on the cross, like that's got to fundamentally reshape your theology and the nearness of God toward those who are crucified.
Yeah, that's the thing that oppressed peoples teach us, back to your point, Rick, is that, you know, I think I've been guilty of this, right? We turn take up your cross and follow me into some sort of metaphor for discipleship. But I think to the communities of people who had cousins and uncles and sisters and brothers who were crucified, the immediate illocution is not metaphorical. Like, people aren't thinking in metaphor when they think of a cross because they know names and have dates when people they love died on them. And so the oppressed teach me to see solidarity, suffering solidarity, and place sharing as one of the highest acts of powerful, vindicating love one can have for their neighbor. I mean, Jesus says these exact words about laying down your life for a friend, right?
Hmm.
And I think once you experience the horror of a cross, you no longer can conceive of the greatest good willing the cross,
Yeah.
meaning as a weapon, or as seeing it as good. You just can't see it as good, right?
Yeah.
Usually the people who want to fight in wars have never fought in a war.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
kind of the same idea.
So then bringing all this around to the institution idea, it's like to
Yeah.
me, the institution that crucifies and defends the territory of an empire is the dominating institution, the one that's going to harm people. But the institution that is a presence with the suffering is going to be an institution that has the power to heal people. And I just wonder, like, what could it be like if we had institutions that were a presence in and among
Mm.
those who are suffering?
Yeah. So institutions run on mammon in our world, and it's amazing just looking at our religio-political climate right now, just how much money is involved in what's happening. And so there are hundreds of communities doing exactly what you're saying right now. They just maybe they lack the architecture and the financing and the website and the branding to be known as institutions, because typically institutions are built with money on imperial power, and the imperial sort of gospel is that you, Rick and Matt, don't have to suffer because you're a part of this institution. And if there's going to be any institution, we inflict it. And so I think those of us in institutions like myself who have made money and achieved power off of violence, not exclusively, but definitely, we have a work of reparation to do to put ourselves in solidarity in the way of and with and under the poor, the suffering, the marginalized, and leverage our capital there without ruining it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, there are hundreds of communities around the world doing this now. I find stories like this and read them to maintain hope, because I need it. But it can be something as simple as it's Pride Month this month, and my diocese will have a table at the Pride Festival, and I'm going to spend 3 to 4 hours at the table, just being present among a population that has been told by millions of Christians that God doesn't love them.
Mm-hmm.
And that, that's not everything. That's not the only thing, but it's part of what I mean by a reparation of truth and embodied solidarity as an institution, wearing my collar and a t-shirt that says the Episcopal Church among and with people who have been told there's no place for them in churches. So it's discrete acts like that, but then it's also, I think there's some systemic structural initiatives that need to happen in order for large institutions like mine to do what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts with us.
Yeah, man, it's a gift to be here and to spend time with you.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.